The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Jamal Henderson pulled into his driveway. The soft hum of his electric sedan fell silent as he parked in front of his recently purchased home, a sleek, two-story house nestled in a quiet, upscale neighborhood on the edge of the city. He stepped out in a navy blue suit, briefcase in hand, his polished shoes clicking against the cobblestone walkway leading to the front porch. It had been a long day of design presentations and back-to-back client meetings at the architecture firm where he served as lead designer. All he wanted now was a hot shower and some time with the jazz vinyls he loved collecting. As he reached into his pocket for the house keys, headlights suddenly flashed behind him, flooding the front yard in a harsh glare. Confused, Jamal squinted into the brightness, turning halfway toward the source. A firm voice barked from behind the lights, "Step away from the door. Hands where we can see them." Two uniformed officers emerged from a patrol car, hands hovering near their weapons. For a moment, Jamal was too stunned to respond. "Excuse me?" he asked, glancing from one officer to the other. "This is my house." But they weren't listening. One officer stepped forward, hand already on his cuffs. "We've had a call about a suspicious individual trying to break into a house. Do not resist." Jamal's eyes widened. "I live here. I just got home from work. My ID is in my—" He didn't even finish his sentence before he was spun around, arms forced behind his back, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists. Panic and disbelief surged through him. Neighbors had started peeking through blinds and doors. No one intervened. As Jamal was shoved into the back seat of the police cruiser, a single question echoed in his mind. How can someone be arrested for coming home while black? Across the street, behind a partially drawn curtain, Mrs. Callahan clutched her phone tightly, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She was the one who'd called the police just 15 minutes earlier. "There's a suspicious man trying to break into 442, Maple Grove," she'd told dispatch. "He doesn't look like he belongs here." That vague sentence was all it took to summon armed officers into the peaceful neighborhood. She didn't know Jamal Henderson. She hadn't bothered to welcome him when he moved in 3 weeks prior. All she saw that night was a black man at the front door of a nice house. That to her was enough. On the adjacent lawn, Mr. Patel stood with his arms crossed, watching in disbelief as Jamal was pushed into the squad car. He'd met Jamal at the HOA meeting just a week ago. They'd exchanged business cards, even chatted about real estate trends. "Wait, that's Jamal," he said aloud, stepping off his porch. "That's the new homeowner. What the hell are they doing?" His voice carried down the street, but the officers ignored him. They were too focused on controlling the suspect. Other neighbors began to emerge, some filming with their phones, others whispering nervously. A few looked ashamed, realizing what was happening, but doing nothing to stop it. Mr. Patel tried again, louder this time. "You've got the wrong guy. He owns that house." One officer briefly glanced in his direction, but said nothing. Inside the cruiser, Jamal stared out the window, breathing heavily. He could see people watching. Some looked sympathetic, others curious. But no one moved to stop the injustice. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but fury. Everything about this was wrong. He had worked for years to build a life of security and success. Yet, none of it had shielded him from this moment. Not the degree, not the job, not the neighborhood, not even the keys in his hand. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed faintly as Jamal sat in a holding cell, wrists sore and patience thinner than ever. His suit jacket had been taken off, folded haphazardly on a bench nearby, and his phone, wallet, and house keys were sealed in a clear plastic evidence bag labeled Unknown Suspect. He stared at the cold, gray wall in front of him, anger pulsing just beneath his calm exterior. No one had read him his rights. No one had allowed him a phone call. And despite trying to explain who he was multiple times during the drive, the officers seemed more interested in treating him like a trespasser than verifying the truth. Outside the holding area, Officer Dempsey stood at the front desk reviewing the intake form. "No priors, no ID on him either," he muttered, tapping his pen against the counter. "Something feels off." His partner, Officer Lee, shrugged. Guy looked like he was breaking in. Let's just wait for someone to come claim him. Dempsey hesitated. He said something about being an architect, claimed he was working on some downtown development project. That's when Officer Dempsey got curious. He grabbed Jamal's phone from the evidence bag and powered it on. The lock screen showed a professional headshot of Jamal in a suit, standing before a model of a skyscraper. Notifications flooded in, emails from clients, calendar reminders, and texts from contacts with names like city planner and deputy mayor. Dempsey tapped through to the emergency contact info. His jaw clenched as he read the name listed at the top, Mayor Danielle Rivers. He swallowed hard and looked at Lee. We need to make a call. 10 minutes later, in a quiet office down the hall, Dempsey nervously dialed the mayor's private line. When her assistant answered, he stammered. We've detained someone who might be connected to the mayor. Name's Jamal Henderson. A brief silence followed. Then the assistant's voice sharpened. You arrested who? The click of the line disconnecting felt louder than it should have. Dempsey wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. Back in the cell, Jamal closed his eyes, unaware that the wheels of justice were finally starting to turn, but not the way the precinct expected. Mayor Danielle Rivers was still in her office when the call came through. Her assistant's voice was strained, almost hesitant. Ma'am, the police just called. They've detained Jamal Henderson. Danielle froze, mid-sentence, her pen halting above the city budget report. Detained, she repeated, incredulous. For what? The assistant's voice lowered. They arrested him outside his own house. Said someone reported him as a suspected intruder. For a split second, the mayor stared at the wall, her mind blank. Then a slow, cold fury rose in her chest. Get the car. Now. Within 30 minutes, Mayor Rivers stepped out of her black SUV in front of the precinct, flanked by 2 aides and a driver who was still on the phone, trying to get the police chief on the line. Word had already spread. Reporters were beginning to arrive, snapping photos and asking questions. But Danielle didn't flinch. She pushed open the precinct door and marched inside with the command of someone who knew the weight her presence carried. The lobby fell silent. Officers froze mid-conversation. Some stood up straighter. Others looked away. She didn't wait for introductions. Where is he? She asked the front desk officer, her voice firm and unyielding. Where's Jamal Henderson? The officer stuttered before pointing toward the holding cells. Down the hall, ma'am. Last door on the right. She walked past them, not bothering to wait for permission. When the door opened, Jamal looked up. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by quiet relief. Let him out, she said sharply to the guard, who immediately fumbled for keys. The cuffs came off. Jamal stood, adjusting his sleeves, trying to maintain composure, even as humiliation clung to him like smoke. Danielle, he murmured. They didn't even check who I was. I know, she said, her voice tight, but everyone's going to know now. She turned back toward the corridor, where a handful of stunned officers still stood. You didn't just arrest an innocent man. You arrested the man designing your entire downtown revitalization plan. Her eyes narrowed. And believe me, this city is about to learn exactly what happens when racism wears a badge. By morning, the video had swept across every major social platform. A passerby had filmed the arrest from behind a bush, catching the moment Jamal was handcuffed at his front door. The clip had gone viral overnight, with hashtags like #ArrestedAtHome and #WhileBlack trending nationally. People were outraged, sharing clips of Jamal's credentials, his architectural projects, and, most damning of all, the silence of the officers as his neighbors tried to vouch for him. It was no longer a local mistake. It was a national embarrassment. Mayor Danielle Rivers called a press conference before noon. The City Hall atrium was packed with media, officials, activists, and concerned citizens. The backdrop bore the seal of the city, but all eyes were on the 2 people standing at the podium, the mayor and Jamal Henderson. He wore the same suit from a night before, now freshly pressed. He stood tall, composed, but there was no mistaking the quiet fury behind his calm eyes. Danielle stepped up first. Last night, a respected black man was arrested in his own driveway. Not because of a crime, not because of any evidence, but because he didn't look like he belonged in his own neighborhood. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. This city prides itself on progress, but progress without accountability is an illusion. She turned to Jamal and stepped aside. He spoke slowly, deliberately. I wasn't going to say anything. I wasn't going to make this public. I've dealt with these kinds of assumptions before. But this time, I was arrested, cuffed, publicly humiliated, for coming home. The room was dead silent. I'm not standing here because I'm special. I'm standing here because I have a title and a platform. But what about the people who don't? Who get thrown into the system and never get a microphone like this? The crowd erupted into applause, long, thunderous, and full of anger. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It had become a movement, and the city's silence had just been shattered. Within 72 hours of the press conference, the city's police department was in full crisis mode. The two arresting officers, Dempsey and Lee, had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation. But behind the scenes, the damage ran deeper than disciplinary memos. The mayor had authorized an emergency review of department-wide practices, bringing in independent civil rights experts and community watchdogs. Mayor Rivers wasn't playing politics. She was issuing a wake-up call. The police chief, under increasing pressure, issued a carefully worded apology, acknowledging that a grave mistake had occurred. But the public wasn't buying it. Protests had begun forming outside the precinct, peaceful but firm, with signs reading, I am Jamal, license keys still arrested, and homeowner is not equal to criminal. The media was relentless, digging up other stories, less publicized but strikingly similar. It was clear Jamal's case wasn't a one-off incident. It was a symptom of a deeper rot. At City Hall, Jamal had been invited to co-chair the newly formed Citizens Oversight Committee, tasked with reviewing police conduct, bias training, and accountability systems. He accepted, not out of vengeance, but because he knew real change required more than speeches. We don't need Band-Aids, he said during the committee's first meeting. We need to stop bleeding. In his office, Jamal was back to work on blueprints and development proposals, but something in him had shifted. His sketches were sharper, his focus more intense. The same hands that once drew bridges and towers now helped redraw the blueprint of the city's justice system. And the officers who had once dismissed him as just another face in the dark were now part of training simulations shown citywide as the example of what not to do. From his home to the mayor's office, Jamal's story had traveled through power, policy, and pain. But he wasn't finished. The foundation had been shaken. Now it was time to rebuild, fairer, stronger, and just. The ripple effects of that night reached every corner of Jamal's neighborhood. Once a quiet, manicured community of silence and assumptions, Maple Grove was now under an uncomfortable microscope. The residents who had previously smiled politely from their porches now avoided eye contact, weighed down by guilt or discomfort. Some felt shame for not speaking up, while others struggled to reconcile their passive biases with the man now seen on national news as a symbol of dignity and change. For Jamal, simply walking to his mailbox had become an act of silent resilience. Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who made the 911 call, finally came to his door days later. She held a tin of cookies, eyes cast downward, her voice brittle with forced humility. I just thought someone was breaking in. I didn't know. Jamal took a deep breath, accepting her words but not excusing them. You didn't know me, he replied evenly. You didn't try to. That's the problem. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. But his words struck harder than any shout could. In contrast, Mr. Patel approached Jamal during one of his evening walks. I'm sorry I couldn't stop them that night, he said earnestly. But I'm here now. If there's anything you need from city meetings to advocacy, I'm with you. It was the start of a slow but genuine shift. Other neighbors followed. Community forums were organized, the first hosted in Jamal's own backyard. Residents gathered to talk about implicit bias, systemic injustice, and what accountability truly looked like. Black residents from nearby areas joined in, offering stories that mirrored Jamal's, proof that his experience was not rare, only finally recognized. Mayor Rivers continued to support the grassroots movement forming in the neighborhood. She encouraged more cross-cultural community-building events, and Jamal, though hesitant at first, often stood in front of his neighbors as a voice of reason and resilience. "I don't want to be the guy they almost ruined," he said during one gathering. "I want to be the guy who helped them wake up." And slowly, Maple Grove began to change, not just in policy or reputation, but in perspective. It started with Jamal. But now, it belonged to everyone willing to grow. 6 months later, the downtown city council chamber buzzed with anticipation. Architects, developers, city officials, and community leaders filled the room, eager to hear the revised proposal for the city's most ambitious redevelopment project to date. At the front stood Jamal Henderson, calm, poised, and carrying a large set of rolled blueprints under one arm. But this time, he wasn't just there as the architect. He was there as a voice of lived experience, as someone whose personal story had ignited institutional change. He stepped to the podium, cleared his throat, and unfolded a new rendering of the city center, a design now featuring wider walkways, open-air communal spaces, public art honoring unsung city heroes, and a civic pavilion named the Belonging Center. The design wasn't just concrete and glass, it was a statement. But before diving into the details, Jamal paused, looked out over the crowd, and said, "Before I talk about what we're building, I want to talk about what tried to break me." He recounted the night he was arrested outside his own home. The shame, the silence, the cold steel on his wrists, the looks of his neighbors, and then the shift, how the truth spread, how the city stood with him, and how the mayor didn't hesitate to turn outrage into action. "You all know me as an architect," he said, "but now I've learned to design more than buildings. I've learned how to help design change." A standing ovation followed, not just for his blueprints, but for his courage. Mayor Rivers, seated in the front row, nodded with pride. Jamal's committee had already implemented 3 major policy shifts in police training, transparency, and neighborhood engagement. But this was his masterpiece. A physical space rooted in inclusion and memory, a permanent symbol of what had happened and what would never happen again. That evening, Jamal returned home as the sky blushed with the colors of dusk. He parked in the same driveway, walked the same steps, and unlocked the same door, but everything felt different. Not because the world had fully changed, but because he had helped move it, just enough to matter. Just enough to prove that from injustice, a new blueprint could rise.